Here's the real thing. If Santa becomes the center of Christmas, even St. Nicholas himself would not approve of such a thing. Hey everyone, Pastor BJ here, coming to you from Kirkmont Church. One of the things that always comes to mind when we think about Christmas is, of course, Santa Claus. Now, whether you realize it or not, Santa Claus is a tad bit of a controversial figure in certain segments of conservative Christianity. And so it's time to take a little closer look at Christmas by asking, what do we do with Santa Claus? All right. Being able to sort out fact from legend when it comes to this figure known as Santa Claus is nigh impossible. The story of him having a workshop filled with elves that make toys all year, and he gives them to kids unsuspectingly all throughout Christmas Eve is, of course, fictional. But there is no question that there is a historical figure, there's a historical root to where this story came from. And that, of course, is the story of St. Nicholas of Myra. So the best records we have point to a figure named Nicholas who was born to a Christian family, but they were wealthy Greeks. And so as he grew up, he always recognized his wealth and his privilege, and he always wanted to have a way of helping those who were less fortunate. And so after his parents died, he took it upon himself to share their wealth with some of the poorest in the community. And one particular story that is shared is the story of a poverty-stricken father who has 3 daughters. Now, Nicholas is very worried about these 3 daughters because the father doesn't have enough money for a dowry, and that limits the possibility of the daughters being able to get married. And Nicholas is very worried that if they don't get married and they can't find work, that they will too land in poverty and potentially even end up in prostitution. St. Nicholas wants nothing to do with this. And so one night, when the father is asleep and the daughters are in bed, he takes a purse filled with gold coins and he slings it into the window. The next morning, the father sees it. He is rejoicing at the gift that God has given them and is ultimately able to find a husband for his first daughter. Well, once Nicholas sees the success of that story, he does it again. He takes another bag of coins, he slings it into the window, and as the story goes, the second daughter is able to find a husband as well. Now, the father realizes something is afoot here, and so Nicholas, as he starts coming in to deliver the third bag of gold coins, is caught by the father. And Nicholas begs him, please don't tell anybody that I'm doing this. I don't want anybody to give me the glory. I want them to realize that God is generous. And so he sets this very godly example of anonymous giving. And as the historical story goes, the third daughter is ultimately married and the family is saved from poverty. Now, that is probably a fairly historically reliable story, but the story begins to evolve and legend begins to develop around it. So one telling of the story is that as St. Nicholas was coming to deliver the third bag of coins, the father is standing by the window, but Nicholas sees him first. And so he sneaks up and throws the coins down the chimney. And it just so happens that the daughters have some wet socks or stockings hanging up by the fireplace to dry, and the coins land into the stockings. And then when the daughters take the stockings down, surprise, there's their gold coin. And so you can see how the story develops and the legend builds. Now, there are lots of folks that have taken the time to show where all these legends have developed, and I'll put a couple of links in the description if you want to dig more deeply into that. There's also a story of St. Nicholas that is fascinating to me, that is relatively new, to me at least. I just read about it not long ago, and I'll share it with you here. So one of the things that happened is that St. Nicholas ultimately ended up becoming a bishop over the city of Myra. He had some family connections. His uncle was a bishop, and eventually Nicholas, because of his godliness and his piety and his holiness and devotion to the Christian faith, became a bishop as well. And so in the year 325, the Council of Nicaea occurs, and Nicholas of Myra was there. Now, That is, of course, a historical fact. Now, the council was held to discuss the idea of the Trinity and who Jesus was. And on one side, you had what we think of as Orthodox Christianity, where Jesus is part of the divine triune God. He is God the Son. And that's the side that St. Nicholas would have been on. On the other side was a guy named Arius, who is ultimately condemned as a heretic because he held a false view. His position can be summarized by saying there was a time when the Son was not. It's just basically a way of saying that Jesus was not truly divine. Now, all of that is, of course, historically accurate. St. Nick was a part of that discussion. He's on several lists that list all of the bishops that were a part of that. But one of the stories that came out, probably legendary, but still nonetheless worth sharing, is that in the midst of this discussion, Arius is talking about how Jesus is not divine, and Nicholas of Myra just can't stand it anymore. His passions flare up, and he runs over and he slaps the guy across the face, or in some tellings, he punches him right in the face. And of course, it scandalizes the whole council, and he's ultimately rebuked by the leadership, and he's defrocked for a short period of time before being restored. I got to be honest with you, that's my kind of Santa Claus right there. So, all right. Well, with all of that being said, the fact of the matter is there's some legend, there's some historicity there, but oftentimes as a pastor, the question will come up to me, BJ, do you think we should tell our kids about Santa Claus? What do you think about Santa Claus? And the thinking goes like this. There's two sides to this. One side is basically to say, no, we need to celebrate. This is a time of the year when we celebrate Jesus' birth, and St. Nicholas is a great opportunity to do that. And even if he is filled with all sorts of legends, it's just a fun thing to do. And on the other side, there are folks that will say, honestly, Santa Claus is not in the Bible. The Christmas story is glorious without him, and it keeps us from bringing in all of these fictional stories. And so, you know what? We're just going to stay away from Santa Claus altogether. The first thing to say is this. This is clearly an area of Christian liberty, okay? We obviously want to be very cautious about these kinds of things. If you have a brother who does not tell their kids about Santa Claus, who doesn't, do anything whatsoever related to Santa Claus, that's fine. Let them be. Don't look down your nose at them as if if they're doing something wrong. They're clearly not. Likewise, if you have somebody who teaches their kids that Santa Claus is going to bring them a gift, and then as they get older, then, they tell them that he's a fictional character or some kind of legendary figure, that's okay too. There's nothing sinful on either side of this. And so we need to kind of let brothers and sisters make this decision on their own. But here is where I would caution. We didn't do Santa Claus in our house. Santa Claus is, in some ways, sort of like the Grinch or like the Minions or something. They're like a fictional character. They're a fun fictional character. But we never told our kids that Santa was bringing them gifts. We just said, Santa was a fun character, and he was a jolly guy who is a good example of giving generously. And so that was not something we ever did in our house. In fact, I spent time teaching them the historical stories of St. Nicholas, and they love that story and all of the other stories related to it just as much as the elves and things like that. So we never hated on Santa. We never looked askance at him and thought that he was sinful, but we never told them that he was bringing them gifts. But I will say this. It's perfectly okay if you do. It's quite okay. Now, you do want to be cautious. You don't want this to go on till they're 12 years old and all of a sudden, surprise, we've been misleading you all this time, right? So you want to kind of have some balance here. But listen, the fact of the matter is this. The biggest concern about Santa Claus is making sure that he doesn't steal the show. And honestly, if Christmas has become all about getting presents and Santa coming to take things from me, then we've kind of missed the point. And you got to be honest. Here's the real thing. If Santa becomes the center of Christmas, even St. Nicholas himself would not approve of such a thing. St. Nicholas would want us to be generous and to give presents, and he would also want us to remember that the reason we are celebrating is because of the birth of our Savior, the incarnation, Emmanuel. Brothers and sisters, that's a closer look at Christmas.